Hello and welcome to Prime Code Media. In this video, I'll be discussing Bootstrap Forms, focusing on, as the documentation puts it here, examples and usage guidelines for form control styles, layout options, and custom components for creating a wide variety of forms. Now, as part of this discussion, I am going to use a contact form that I have just created. So this is the contact form. It has three inputs: name, email, subject, as well as a text area and a submit button at the bottom here. Now, to start things off, let's just take a look at the form control. Now, with regards to form control, I must put it out from the get-go that the reason why this contact form looks the way it does, this is because of the control form class, or the form control class, I beg your pardon. Now, this is the example of the form that of the class that I am talking about. This is the form control. Now, to show you what I mean by this, I'm just going to remove this class from this first input here, and you'll see how it looks without this class. I'm just going to come inside here, insert my code editor, and then I am going to delete this class form control here. Now, let's go back to my browser and see how it looks without this class. Now, here's how this input looks without that form control class, and this shows, as I was saying, that form control classes can be used to affect the style and appearance of input elements. Now, next, we can change the height of input elements. To change the height of input elements, we will use one of these classes, form control LG, to enlarge the size, and the form control SM to make the size smaller. So let's put this into practice. But before I do that, let me just put back that class form control back, so that the input looks how it did earlier. Let me just save and go back to my browser to ensure that the input is back to how it was. Now, fine, everything is back to how it was. What I want to do at the moment is to change the height, to enlarge this input here. And to do that, as I said, I'm going to add a class here, and the class is form control LG for large. Now, let me save once again. Let's go back to the browser and see, refresh. Now, as you can see, this input is now larger than this one. The name input is larger than the email input. So, and this is because of the class that we have just added, and that is the form control LG class. So maybe for purposes of consistency, I'm just going to add this class to the email and subject inputs as well. I'm just going to come in here and copy this class like so, and then I am going to first paste it inside here, and then I am also going to paste it right here. Now, let's save and go back to the browser to see if we achieve the consistency that we set ourselves out to. Yeah, now here's how our inputs look. They are now of the equal height, and this is because we have used this class form control LG. We can also disable inputs by adding the disabled boolean. So the documentation says all we need to do that is to add the disabled boolean attribute on an input to give it a grayed out appearance, remove pointer events, and prevent the focusing. So let's try this out on one of our inputs. So this is the attribute that we will have to add. So this is the Boolean attribute with that we'll have to add in order to achieve that. So I'm just going to try this out on this input right here. So I am going to add it right here. and say disabled. Okay, like so. Let me save. Let's go back to our browser and refresh. Now you'll see that the first input will be grayed out. Here it is now grayed out. Even when we try to click inside it, we are unable to do that, which is what we are able to do. For example, on this one, we are able to get inside this one and type, but we are unable to do that on this one, and this is because we have disabled it by adding this disabled attribute, or the boolean right here of the disabled, and that disables the input. Now what the Bootstrap also allows us to do is to add a read only boolean. Okay, is to add a read only boolean attribute on an input to prevent modification of the input's value. Now I am going to add a this class, the read only boolean, to the second one here. I'm just going to add it to this second, or let me just add it to the subject input here. So I'm going to first add value here. Let me write okay, let me just write subject. Subject here. Okay, now let me save this and let's go back to the browser and see how it looks. Okay, let's just refresh. Now here's how the value looks. So we are able to come inside here and then maybe delete this and then write whatever it is that we want to write here. Let's say maybe the subject is request for information or quotation, like so. So we are able to do whatever it is that we want to do. All we have to do is just to delete or remove the value of this input. So what we want to do, we want to turn this into a read only, so that the user cannot come in here and, for example, delete this and write whatever it is that they want to do. And in order to achieve that, we will have to add a read only boolean attribute. So let me add a read only boolean attribute here, like so. Read only. Now let's save and see how that works out. I'm just going to refresh here. Now as you can see, we still have that words, those words inside here, but we are unable to click inside here and do as we please in order to write whatever it is that we want to do. So we can only read the text, we can't write inside here, and this is because we have added this read only boolean, which does what, which disables us to, or makes it impossible for us to write inside that input. The only thing that we are only able to do is to read only. Now what I also want to show you is that we can also change the layout of we can change the layout of forms. For example, if for example we want our elements, that is the name and email element here, to sit next to each other on the same line, or next to each other here on the same line, what we can do, we can use what we learned in our discussion of the grid system. So it is the same principles that we will have to use in order to make these inputs to sit next to each other. Now let's see if the documentation does confirm this. Now here's an example that the documentation provides us with. Now what we will do is that we will have the elements inside a row, and all of them will have classes of columns. Let's go into our code editor and put this into practice. For example, in order to achieve this, remember what I want to do. I want these two inputs and labels and their labels to sit next to each other. So these are the two inputs that I want to change their display. I want these to sit next to each other. So inside here, what I'm going to do is that I am going to first add a div. Let me first create some space here. Okay, let me do this. So I'm going to add a div like so, and then this div is going to have a class of row like so. Now inside this div I am going to add another div, and this div is going to have a class colon like so. Now because here I want to change the display or the layout of two inputs, I'm just going to copy this div and paste it just below here. So we have two of this. Let me just move this so everything is just well indented. Okay, let me do that. Okay, fine. Now I am going to copy the first input here. I'm going to cut it actually. Cut, and then I am going to paste it inside this first div, and then I'm going to come back and cut this second one here, and then paste it inside here. So let me just move everything so that our code looks fine. So let me save my work like so, and then let's go back to the browser and refresh and see if we've been able to change the display of our inputs. There we go. We've managed to change the display of our inputs. They are now no longer sitting on top of each other, but are sitting next to each other on the same line. And we used, as I was explaining earlier, that in order to have a good grasp of this, you can also check out our previous episode on the grid system. It is the same principles that we've used in order to change the display or the layout of these two inputs. Now lastly, what I want to show you is how you can create form labels that float over label input fields. But before we do that, let's check what the documentation says we need to do. The documentation says what we need to do is to wrap a pair of input and label elements in form floating, which means that the parent element should have a form floating class to enable floating labels with Bootstrap's textual form fields. And then it goes on to say a placeholder is required on each input, as our method of CSS only floating labels uses the placeholder shown pseudo element. Finally, it says also note that the input must come first so we can utilize a sibling selector. Now to put this into practice, I am going to use this subject input. Inside my documentation here, let's take a look at the subject input. Okay, here it is right here. So this is the input and label that I am going to use for this one. Now to wrap both this label and input, I'm not even going to create a new div. I'm just going to come inside here. This is the apparent element. So I'm going to add a class form floating as instructed by the documentation. So this is the class as instructed here by the documentation right here. So let me just refresh and see how it looks. Now as you can see, the label has moved inside here after adding that form floating class. And then when we try to type inside here, the word subject, it doesn't move, it doesn't float away, so that we are able to type. So it doesn't clear the way or move out of our way so that we can type. So it stays where it is. So what we want it to do, we want this word to float, to move out of the way, so that we can be able to type whatever it is that we want to type inside here. Now it does this because we are not done. Let's see what the documentation says we need to also do. It says here a placeholder is required on each input. So let's just go inside here and add a placeholder. Okay, I'm going to add a placeholder here, subject, like so. And then what else? Let's see what the documentation says. It says here, note that the input must come first. So let's come inside here. I'm going to cut this input from here. I'm cutting it, and then I am going to paste it above the label, like so. So I've pasted the label, that is the input, above the label. Let me just make sure that everything is well indented, like so. Now let me save, and then let's go check out how our contact form looks right now. Let me refresh, like so. Now let me try to type inside here. Now you'll see that when I put in my cursor inside this input, that word subject moves out of the way for us so that we can type. Let's say, for example, our subject is request for information, for example, request for info, like so. So the word subject has moved out of our way, unlike earlier where it just stayed and it made everything look quite cluttered. So when we have moved our cursor outside, it moves back to where it was, and then when we come inside here, it makes way for us, so it floats out of the line where we are going to type. So that brings us to the end of our discussion of Bootstrap Forms. Please play around with the code, try out the different things, and please feel free to share how it's going in the comments section so that we can learn together. Maybe you can even create some fascinating stuff that I have not even touched on, because there is a lot that I have not discussed. We just scratched the surface really on this one. So till we code again next time, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye.